Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 541 through 544, which will cover manga chapters 622 through 624. And this flashback is pretty dense, as I said, with a lot of different things. So this is going to be a little bit longer of an episode, I feel like, as we get into the Sun Pirates and Fisher Tiger. So, synopsis. Jinbei continues with the history of Fishman Island, where the Straw Hats learn about Fisher Tiger forming the Sun Pirates to help liberate the world from the world government. Along the way, they come across a former slave girl named Koala, which they promise to return home, but along the way, tragedy strikes, causing a rift in the Sun Pirates. Alright, so differences. There are a lot of things to talk about in terms of differences with these episodes. So first off, there's a moment earlier on in these episodes that's not present in the anime that I think should have been left. And that's the moment where in the anime they depict as Jinbei lecturing the Marines about how slavery is okay to them, but freeing slaves is not. And you see him grab a Marine soldier and yell at him and then kind of throw him down. But in the manga, he's actually beating this guy unconscious. And Arlong, of all people, has to tell him that he's beating an already unconscious person and kind of telling him to stop. And this, I feel, is important in showing just how far Jinbei has come by the end of this flashback, or even just the midway point at the end of these episodes, on how much Fisher Tiger and Otohime has helped him grow into the compassionate man he is in the present day, and to show Jinbei be so much more brutal and violent that Arlong, of all people, thought he was going too far, and in the end helps to kind of contrast the two different paths that the two of them end up going down. How what Jinbei took away from Tiger getting assassinated was the right message of this needs to change, and then the message that Arlong took away was that he needed to be more hateful of humans and seek vengeance even more than that. Another thing in the opposite kind of end of that is I didn't like seeing changed for Fisher Tiger is that it shows him being a little hypocritical, even if it was really meant as a scare tactic. But in the anime, it shows him threatening Rear Admiral Kadar by holding him over the water as if he's going to toss him overboard and kill him. But I feel like this also kind of takes away from Tiger's philosophy of trying his best to not perpetuate negative images of Fishman. Although this one is a little less egregious than the first one, since it already shows him kind of beating up a bunch of Marine soldiers anyways, so it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but it's a little unnecessary, I feel like, to add this. And speaking of Rear Admiral Kadar, in the anime it shows him a lot more of a fearful person of Tiger, but in the manga he pretty much stands his ground and fights without whimpering and kind of being all scared like a weakling for some reason in the anime. I don't know why they chose to go in this direction for this character, considering he's not like that in the manga. Although he has far less scenes, so there's not much moments for that to happen. So maybe that was the intent with the character, but it's never shown in the manga. Now, moving on into episode 543, many of the scenes of Tiger taking Koala home are extended, like the people having extra lines of dialogue, of them celebrating her return, where in the manga there aren't actually any lines of dialogue, and it's all told through just images. And I'm actually alright with this change, as it doesn't really change much, but it adds a lot more emotion to the moment with the dialogue, as well as, showing kind of their disdain for Tiger. And then also Koala's goodbye is a lot longer with actual dialogue too, because in that scene, the manga, there is no dialogue. Again, it's all told through visuals. And then Tiger thinking to himself that he wants to believe that this will change the future for humans and fishmen. That little inner monologue is also added as well. Now, when we get to the actual ambush, in the anime, there's far less blood covering Tiger during this. And in the manga, he's absolutely covered in it, making his death by major blood loss make more sense. Of course, I understand why they did this, to kind of censor it for younger audiences. And overall, it doesn't really change much, if anything. But, it does kind of make a lot more sense why they needed a blood transfusion for him, because he lost so much blood, and you can really see it visually in the manga. When Jinbei goes to help Tiger, the anime shows Jinbei actually attacking Rear Admiral Strawberry, where In the manga, it just shows Jinbei yelling, "You bastard Marines!" and then it kind of cuts away to the next scene. You don't actually see him lunge at Strawberry and then kind of like throw him into the ground. Next is in the manga, there's some narration that basically transitions from the ambush scene to the infirmary scene, but the anime opts to flash ahead back to the present to have Jinbei kind of provide the transition dialogue, and then it flashes right back to the past. This actually happens a couple times in the flashback, but in the manga, there's actual like narration text boxes as if the disembodied narrator is saying all this. Another change is in the manga, it looks like Aladdin has at least treated Tiger's wounds, and Tiger is all bandaged up. But for some reason, he's not really treated at all in the anime. I don't know why this changed. Like, I wonder if they made a creative choice to keep his sun tattoo visible so that when he gives his speech and says that one quote, "Their blood is filthy," and you can see him like reach for his chest when rejecting the marine blood, they haven't put his hand there where the original celestial dragon brand used to be. So maybe they wanted to keep that emotion and that visual storytelling, so they left the bandages off. That's just my thought. Another change is in the anime during Tiger's final moments, we see a small further flashback of how Tiger earned the respect of Jinbei and the other people of the Fishman district by beating them all up. And that's not in the manga as well. Again, that's another change that I don't really care too much about. In fact, I actually kind of liked it included. Now, moving on to episode 544, the anime shows Arlong going on his vengeance-fueled attack on the Marines back at Fulshao Island, with a scene of Hachi trying to stop him. But in the manga, it cuts right to the moment where Borsellino already has taken him down and Arlong's already all bloodied on the ground after being shot with a laser through the chest. Similarly, when the anime flashes forward to the present to have Jinbei transition him as taking over the captain of the Sun Pirates after reading the news of Arlong's capture, in the manga, again, this is handled by the narrator instead. Another change is in the anime, in the scene where the citizens withdraw their signatures. Some of them give the reason that they do this because the pirates that Otohime rescued from the shipwreck turned around and robbed them. This is not in the manga. The manga doesn't really give them a reason. They just take the signatures back. I don't quite know which one I like better. I think it's definitely a lot more devastating for Otohime that they just randomly decided to withdraw their signatures. But I also like the idea that there was a reason for these folks to withdraw their signatures. So I think from a storytelling perspective, I could go either way, but I think I prefer them giving the reason, so I do like this change in the anime. Next is there's this scene where Aladdin is talking about how as a slave he has no place to go other than on this ship as a pirate with this other fishman. This is added in the anime presumably to kind of give more explicit reason as to why Jinbei decides to accept the invitation to become the Shichibukai, although you could gather most of this through context and subtext, because later on you see them all being able to leave the ship, all those that want to. The final difference is that the whole ending sequence of Jinbei fighting Arlong, the Sun Pirates splitting up, and Aladdin and Jinbei kind of talking about how Arlong can't see that this way is a mistaken way, and that if he ever does anything wrong, that they will go and stop him. And all that in the anime kind of happens on the same island. However, in the manga, the fight and the splitting of the Sun Pirates happen on two different islands, and the conversation between Jinbei and Aladdin actually happens on the ship. And so the manga gives the impression that this happens over a longer period of time. It almost makes it seem like the fight with Arlong happens on one island after they get him out of Impel Down. Then the conversation happens while they're sailing, and then at some point while they're sailing on another island, that's when Macro and his group split off from the Sun Pirates, completing the splintering of the Sun Pirates into the three distinct groups. Now that was a lot of differences. I think that's the most differences I've ever talked about in any one episode, but we can finally get into the episodes themselves. Although, first, a couple things before we get started. So, episode 542, I won't be going into as there isn't really much to go over. It's another filler episode which crosses over with the series Toriko yet again, kind of like how episode 492 did. This episode, if you're interested, is a two-part story. This is a second part of a story that's comboed with episode 51 of Toriko. And just like its previous iteration, you need to watch both series to get the whole story. Aside from that, there's nothing all that interesting to discuss, so I'm just going to skip right past it. The other thing I wanted to mention that I forgot to point out in my last episode about the Sun Pirates kind of covering their celestial dragon slave marks with the Sun Pirate mark is a little poetic, since Nami ended up doing the same thing with her Arlong Pirate tattoo with the pinwheel and tangerine tattoo. And I don't know how I forgot that reference, but I wanted to mention that since I feel it's a pretty important parallel. All right, phew. Now we can actually get into the actual story again, and we see the effects of Tiger's actions against the Celestial Dragons and the world government has on the people of Fishman Island, as they are excited to see one of their own fighting back, but this is inversely and adversely affecting Otohime's cause, as the people would rather see fishmen fighting against humans rather than trying to befriend them. Otohime realizes that it is an impossible task with the current generation, but she's looking far into the future where the kids of today can be taught about the beliefs of coexistence, that they may one day grow into people that can accept intermingling with humans. And we'll see later on that this is what Fisher Tiger was also going for, just in his own way. And one kind of parallel that you can kind of make with this is with Otohime and Fisher Tiger. There's a bit of a parallel with sort of the civil rights movement here in the US between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, with Otohime kind of sort of being the Martin Luther King Jr. and then Fisher Tiger being sort of the Malcolm X equivalent. And you do see that parallel. And I'll go into that more towards the end of the flashback, as well as maybe when I sort of do the review of the entire arc to sort of get the whole context of things. But you can definitely kind of see that sort of start to form here when you see the two try and get to the same goal, but in a very, very different way. Like, on the one hand, you can already see that while what Tiger is doing is good, his methods has the capacity to breed more animosity, as we see the effects his tales are having on the children, as well as with Hody and his group when they're kids. We all know that seeing this, he grows up to be an even more extreme hater of humans, to the point where he's even more hateful than Arlong, which is saying something. Like, once we get to see the Sun Pirates in action, when the Marines are chasing after them to get the slave fishermen that Tiger freed, they go on the offensive and attack in a completely one-sided affair, as the Sun Pirates completely outmatched the crew of the Marines. And a couple things I want to highlight in this sequence. I think the part that stands out to me most is Jinbei. It's clear that at this point, Jinbei is far more of the mind that humans are irredeemable and that coexisting with them is just not possible with how vile they are, especially towards fishmen. And you can really see Jinbei is far more brutal and angry than his present-day counterpart too. And in fact, this is the Jinbei I think many of us expected when we were first imagining Jinbei, when he was mentioned all the way back in the East Blue. We even later see him get reprimanded by Tiger alongside Arlong as being too brutal and going too far. And this is where that scene that was taken out kind of comes into play, because we don't really get to see Jinbei that brutal, but with that scene where he's beating down an unconscious Marine gives this scene a lot more context. And it also, this is the Jinbei that many people in the public knew, which is probably what let Yosaku's initial description of him happen. It's really interesting to see Jinbei start off resistant to Otohime's way of doing things, and that's the crux of this flashback, is seeing how we went from this Jinbei to the present-day Jinbei sitting in front of her grave, saying that they haven't forgotten her ideals, as well as the people of Fishman Island almost treating Otohime like a holy idol with the Fumiya scene. I also just want to point out the insane hypocrisy of the Marines, who supposedly uphold justice, calling freeing slaves a crime and slavery as a lawful act. Like, there's no deeper analysis to that other than, yeah, Jinbei is right. It just seems backwards, and it's amazing to me how so many people, even in this fictional world, are okay with that. But then I realize just how many people in the real world seem to be okay with it. And yeah, makes me really sad how this isn't just relegated to sort of the cartoonishly evil people of a fictional story and fictional world. The other moment that I feel is worth talking about is Tiger's no killing rule. Despite his more violent and antagonistic way of doing things, he wants to be better than his slavers and not stoop to the levels of humans. And we'll see this ideal expanded upon more as we go into the flashback. But lastly, the most insignificant part is I liked seeing Arlong use some of his iconic moves from the Arlong Park arc, where we get to see Shark on darts again, as well as the Kiribachi, the big ass sword that he has. And then, yeah, just seeing him launch himself at like a dart at his opponents at high speeds, impaling them, is funny and kind of cool, just for nostalgia's sakes. But it's after this that Fisher Tiger really shows us what he's all about. He advocates no killing not just because he doesn't want to stoop to the level of humans, but most of all, he wants to stop the cycle of violence and hate. For people like Arlong, it's too late to change their views and they're too far gone. He understands that it's hard because for people like Arlong, it doesn't matter. He doesn't want peace with humans. He wants to become the dominant species because he feels that it's their birthright as the stronger and more physically superior beings. But what Tiger and Otohime and what Jinbei is slowly starting to realize is that it won't matter if they become the dominant species because it will still just continue the cycle of hate, subjugation, and violence in a never-ending cycle. Although their methods are vastly different, Otohime and Tiger both agree on one thing. It's all about saving the future generations, and in their minds, they know that the current generation of people on both sides, it may be too late for. As Tiger even hints that despite him saying all this, he deep down also hates humans as well, but he wants to see a world in which there is peace. He wants to create a world in which people don't fear fishmen and show them that fishmen are not so different from humans. It's quite admirable how despite Tiger hating humans and harboring that quote-unquote devil inside of him, as he puts it, he still doesn't want to spread his hate and tries to do the right thing, understanding that the people who did the horrible things to him and his people does not represent all humans. He wants the cycle of hate to stop with him. Then we get the first of many incredibly heartbreaking parts of this flashback, and that is the introduction of Koala. First off, her whole story, I can't even begin to tell you how chilling this whole thing made me feel the first time. And even to this day, when rereading or rewatching sends a chill down my spine. Like, this poor girl was a slave as a child. She was at least as young as 8 years old and probably even slightly younger. And even after 3 years, she is still incredibly traumatized to the point where she's developed some serious mental health issues of just locking away all emotion and just being conditioned to work and be punished. I mean, my God, this was and still is a little hard to watch. She just constantly has this blank and emotionless smile and speech. Even after getting hit by Arlong, what she does next even shocks Arlong and leaves him speechless, as she just keeps that same blank smile and she rips basically the only thing she owns, which are the tattered clothes off of her back, and starts to apologize profusely and start to wipe away her own blood from the deck of the ship as she continues to bleed from her head injury. And the craziest thing is, she doesn't make any noise in pain when she's struck and doesn't even cry. Just emotionlessly begging for them not to kill her. I can't even begin to imagine the fear. Actually, not fear, just sheer terror she must be experiencing right in that moment, being surrounded by an army of fully grown fishmen who are 20 times bigger than her and 10 times stronger than her, who, for all you know, could instantly kill you at any moment like a bug, but having the courage to risk that because she wants to go home and see her family. You feel so much for Koala to be able to have a happy ending to her story more than anything at this moment. Tiger then does something that's kind of brutal and harsh, but it was ultimately for her benefit, which was also to put a brand over her celestial dragon mark, which even after that, she didn't shed a tear, to which Tiger grabs and yells at her that it's okay to cry. And this is one of those moments where the anime really adds to it because the scream that Koala lets out is just blood-curdling and really adds to sort of the horrific nature of all of this and the practice of the celestial dragon's slavery. Later, to kind of put her mind and soul at ease, he has his crew throw down their weapons and uses this moment to kind of reinforce his no killing rule. And this time it seems to have really gotten through to his crew. All but one, which 3 guesses as to who it was. But yeah, it was Arlong. What's interesting is you can clearly see even Chu and Kurobi were on board with this too, which really just shows how bad of an influence Arlong was. And in this moment, the rest of the crew finally realized what Tiger was talking about, and that they aren't that different, and that it's not humans as a whole who are evil, it's just specific people. When there are slaves, both fishmen and humans, or whatever, it doesn't matter. They're all the same. They're all hurt and scared. Despite how raw this moment was, it's incredibly cathartic to finally see the Sun Pirates begin to embrace Fisher Tiger's philosophy, and for Koala to finally let out all of that bottled up emotion and to finally be able to release what she's been holding in for years. This scene gets me every time and makes me tear up for Koala. It doesn't matter. Like, I always tear up at this moment. Now, after some time has passed, with Koala getting some care and treatment from the crew, it seems like everyone has pretty much warmed up to Koala, and she's on her road to recovery, even though her road to recovery from her mental trauma, as Aladdin mentions, is going to be a difficult one, to which I like that he tells Hachi and everyone else to kind of let her recover on her own pace. You know, I'm no doctor or psychologist, but trauma like that is not something you just magically recover from once you're kind of out of that situation. From my understanding, it can stay with you for a long time or even the rest of your life, and needs to be cared for and worked on slowly, which makes what Arlong does here the worst, as he antagonizes and belittles Koala still. And at this point, you're just like, I'm glad Luffy beat the crap out of Arlong, and in fact, he kind of went easy. He should have been even harder on Arlong. Anyways, the part where he mentions how he sees how the humans have been around them over their travels, and in particular where he mentions if Tiger wasn't there, he wouldn't know what he might have done to them, which is an obvious nod to us, the viewer, knowing exactly what he would do when put in that situation without any oversight from Jinbei or Tiger. And the flashback is great in showing the duality of the two paths that you can go down when in their situations with Arlong and Jinbei, because right after this, Jinbei interjects without any prompting and mentions how from his perspective, it was only a small handful of humans that actually showed any disgust or hostility towards them. And it was a great idea to start Jinbei and Arlong in nearly the same place, both hating humans, but where Arlong couldn't see past his hate and really look at the situation for what it was. Jinbei began to accept both Tiger and Otohime's words. And of course, at this point, Jinbei isn't fully convinced of their messages yet, but at least he's beginning to question his worldview of humans and to think a bit more critically at the situation, which is honestly all you can ask for from anyone in this situation. I mean, in real life, where we just automatically jump to conclusions or go off of initial impressions, it would be better to really sit down and to take a second and understand what is actually going on here with your own thoughts and others. Jinbei here, despite not quite yet buying into the message, is at least trying to take in new information by really observing what, humans are actually doing and looking at alternative angles, like how he mentions maybe the people were scared of us, not because we were fishmen, but more so because we were pirates. He then sits down to genuinely ask Koala why she's scared of them. And when she gives him her answer that it's because she doesn't know them, Jinbei then ponders the fact that it's natural for anyone to fear what they don't understand, and realizes that fish people back on Fishman Island are just the same, and kind of connects the dots that this must be what Otohime has been trying to tell everyone this whole time. As you can probably tell, I really like this scene because we get to see Jinbei actually processing all of this in real time and see the gears turning in his head that maybe Tiger and Otohime are right. There can be a world in which humans and fishmen can coexist peacefully if they took the time to actually understand one another. And this is also true in real life, I feel like, in most circumstances. There are obviously some exceptions. And then there's Hachi, who already seems to be great with humans and kids, and it really makes me kind of sad to think that he was at the very least complicit in allowing Arlong and the others to treat Nami so terribly, even if Nami mentions the fact that Hachi was never really that bad of a guy. And I guess that just shows how strong of an influence Arlong had. And I think that it just shows how dangerous people like Arlong and Hody are, who spread hate and violence. Because not only are they themselves perpetuating terrible things, but they make potentially good people either turn a blind eye or turn them evil, even if they naturally wouldn't have turned out that way. And you can kind of get a sense of that. And it doesn't really, the story doesn't focus on this, but you kind of get the sense that that's what happened with Kurobi and Chu. Like, you see them on board with Jinbei and the rest of the crew. And similarly with the macro pirates, like, it's just like, had they had better influences, they may have not have done evil things, but they were so influenced by some terrible people that they eventually just did terrible things themselves. Then we get a montage of them all having fun on adventures with Koala as they sail to her home. But what's always a little uneasy about this, how like a third of those people go on to do terrible things with the Arlong pirates and the macro pirates. They all do terrible things later in the future, so it's just kind of like a weird dissonance when you rewatch this scene. I mean, you don't even really need to rewatch because these people go on to do bad things. But by the time they get to Koala's home on Full Shout Island, she has become completely comfortable and has become fully comfortable with being around Fishman. And it's really cute how, as Tiger is escorting her back to her home, she wants to hold his hand, but you can see that Tiger is not comfortable with this, as for him, that devil inside of him is still stirring, and his actual hate for humans is kind of preventing this. But because Koala is so damn cute, even he eventually relents and holds her hand, which is, I'm glad that he was able to at least put that aside. And you're really happy for Koala that she's been returned home. But this scene always infuriates me, despite the fact that you can understand everyone's hesitancy, but the least they could do is kind of suck it up for a couple minutes and thank the man who saved their daughter. But if that wasn't bad enough, it gets worse when he's ambushed by the Marines and Rear Admiral Strawberry. And the villagers all knew this. Now, the rest of the crew is also surrounded, which just reinforces Arlong's view of humans. And I get it. Although it's not explicitly stated, the people of the village had to betray the Sun Pirates, because if they didn't, they would have had to return Koala as a slave. So they basically traded her life for Tiger's crew life and the Sun Pirates, which I really can't fault them for, as sucky as it is. But yeah, it's not great. This is where the flashback takes a foreseeable turn, but nonetheless chilling to watch, as Fisher Tiger has sustained a fatal amount of blood loss and will die if he doesn't receive a blood transfusion. And it's at this point you can really tell why Oda decided to insert that whole blood transfusion scene with Sanji in earlier in the arc, to kind of set this moment up, as well as another moment later on in the arc as well. But I just feel like there were so many other ways to show that fishmen were hesitant to mix blood with humans because of this moment with Tiger. But anyways, putting that aside, unfortunately, due to Tiger's rare blood type, no one on the crew carries it, and so they have to turn to the Marines' emergency stockpile in the infirmary aboard the ship they just hijacked. But he vehemently refuses the blood, finally letting out the devil inside of him that he's been referring to. And Tiger has probably the deepest hatred for humans out of all of them due to his time as a slave, which also comes as no surprise to us, but this scene is so freaking raw that it's chilling to read or watch. And particularly in the anime, I think the voice actor for Fisher Tiger is incredible. Like, that initial denial or refusal of the blood, like, it is so visceral. Like, when he screams, "Irena!" like, it's crazy how strong he says it. And you can really feel it. You can feel that, like, hate, that frustration, the desperation, everything come out in that one sentence. And I think it has to do with the fact that up till now, seeing sort of this idealistic and strong person just utterly broken in this moment is what really sells it. Despite, for many of us, these turn of events aren't as much of a surprise, But I can imagine for maybe people who didn't see this coming, it must have hit even harder. For me, what stands out most about Tiger and his character is not so much that he still harbored hatred towards humans, because after what he's had to endure at the hands of humans, it's completely understandable. But it's the fact that in spite of that hatred, he still understood that not all humans are like that, even though he himself he knew was beyond saving in terms of being able to live with humans. He treated his racism and hatred as like a sickness, more so than a part of him that he didn't want to infect other people with. It was unfortunately something he was already infected with, and there wasn't much he himself could do to rid of it, but he did his damnedest to make sure that it didn't spread, and instead that people understood the ideal. He understood that there is a future where humans and fishmen can live in peace, and it depends on the next generation who have yet to be infected by hatred, like Koala and the kids of Fishman Island, and those that still fight for that ideal, like Otohime. He understands exactly what he has done and doesn't regret any of his actions. This moment is so powerful because it makes you take a step back and really think about your own prejudices and really look at understanding yourself introspectively. Like the level of introspectiveness and mindfulness that Fisher Tiger displays is incredible. To have that much amount of resentment and hatred in your heart, yet still have the ability to separate that as just his own and rationally think it through, that repeating the cycle of hate and revenge is not the way. Even if he, out of most people, deserve vengeance more than anyone, he still realizes it's not going to solve anything. In fact, it's just going to lead others to suffer the same horrific fate that he endured. And I can't tell you how important of a message this is, because eventually what you get as the story is telling us is people like Hody, you get people hating things on ideology alone without any connection to anything human, and that just breeds extremism. The further you get from the human element, the easier it becomes to dehumanize. And that's why Tiger was still able to see that not all humans are bad. He was there. He saw other human slaves suffering just like him. He saw other human slaves trying to help each other, like those monks that looked after Koala in the 3 years after their escape. But Hody, on the other hand, who has essentially never really experienced much of humans, he's just heard of the terrible things and all the propaganda and the racism. He already has that hatred for them, more so as an idea, despite not having much interaction with humans. To Hody, it's become his identity to hate humans, and his life mission that's intrinsically tied to that identity of hating humans and seeing that they suffer. And that becomes very difficult for someone like him to separate and let go of, which is what we see happen throughout actually real world history. One thing that stands out about this scene is it kind of adds a bit more to the scene where Jinbei steps in to help Luffy from harming himself after Ace's death. Even though the situations are nothing alike, I can't help but see that with Tiger, Jinbei had to essentially watch his friend and mentor die right in front of him helplessly, even though he could have been saved had he been able to somehow talk him into a life-saving intervention, which is the blood transfusion. Yet with Luffy, he wasn't going to sit by and do nothing, letting Luffy slowly kill himself. And I just think to myself, there must have been a part of him that thought about Tiger in that moment a little bit when he saw Luffy almost kill himself. And that might be my own headcanon and a bit of a stretch, but that's just something that always comes to mind when I think about both of these scenes. Now, Arlong, on the other hand, is also another interesting aspect to this because, like I said a while back in a previous podcast episode, while Arlong is an evil and horrible person, unlike Hody, Arlong actually has an understandable reason why he hates humans. He's seen humans treat fishmen badly, and now they've directly led to the death of his idol, friend, and mentor, to which he goes on a rage-fueled rampage and attacks the fleet of marine ships, but is easily taken out by Vice Admiral Borsellino, aka the future Admiral Kizaru. And it kind of puts things into perspective that despite Arlong always claiming to be the superior race, the existence of devil fruits kind of evens the playing field, if not gives a slight edge to humans in that regard. It gives them the insane powers that basically make being a fishman kind of meaningless if a fishman ate a devil fruit, as we've seen with Vanderdecken. It basically negates one of their greatest advantages, and that's the ability to breathe and swim underwater. Sure, they'd still have their advanced or their enhanced physical strength, But as we see, that's pretty meaningless against a devil fruit, and a fishman eating a devil fruit essentially makes them just like a human, which in Arlong's eyes would be the worst disgrace ever. With Jinbei taking over as captain of the Sun Pirates, he sends word of Tiger's death to Neptune and Otohime, which reinforces her resolve to work even harder to get signatures, build better relations with humans, and teach fishermen children about humans and the surface world. However, despite having collected about 1,000 signatures, because of the kind act of saving shipwrecked humans, turning around and robbing them, all those people decide to rescind their signatures, returning her back to square one. And this one hurts because you can tell how much this hurts her. And she finally goes on a drunk tirade over the island's PA system, giving the people what for. But despite being very angry and disheartened, her resolve seems to be just as strong. Even in her drunk speech, she's still talking about hope for the children of Fishman Island and still tries to inspire people to gather some courage and to fight for what they all really want inside, but they suppress due to their fear and their hesitations. And I mention this only to point out how awesome Otohime is. Even when she has every right to be a little vindictive towards the people, she doesn't actually say anything disparaging towards the people themselves. Even while drunk, she still understands what the people are thinking, and still talks about her dreams and hopes, which really shows just how pure her intentions really are. And even while on a drunk, angry tirade, she still comes across as very kind and inspiring, despite, I think, like, you initially think that she's just going to tell them off, but she doesn't. She's just kind of angry at the situation more so than she is at the people. The story then shifts back to the Sun Pirates, but there's this scene where Rear Admiral Strawberry reports to Borsalino about how Jinbei is the real dangerous one out of that crew, even though they captured Arlong, after sustaining what looks like to be some major injuries. And those injuries is what I want to point out, because Strawberry, for some reason, has bandages wrapped up all up and down his hair, and especially what looks like his immensely tall flat top hair, which looks ridiculous until you realize that according to Oda in an SBS answer, he tells us that Strawberry's race of people has really tall heads, and that tall portion isn't just his hair with like a metric ton of hair product. That's actually his head, which has sustained an injury, which is why it's all bandaged up and why the hat kind of sits on top of the hair. It's not just hair. Like, his actual head is that tall. So if you like shaved off all the hair, you'd see this long column of skin, essentially. But it also begs the question, like, what does his brain look like? Is it that long too? And I feel like as a combatant, like, that head would be an incredible liability. Like, you could easily get hit by that. You could take, like, a sword to that would be devastating for sure. I don't know how this man reached the rank of Rear Admiral and not sustained more injuries like that. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. I just thought it was really funny, and I think Strawberry's design is ridiculous, but also funny at the same time. In any case, this scene then leads into Jinbei wanting to give his crew more freedom and decides to accept the position of a Shibukai to allow his crew to gain amnesty from the world government, as well as to help increase better relations with humans and the world government. And a little small detail I like about this scene that you'd probably miss is that at the opening of that scene, where they get that message, there's this wide shot of the ship at the beginning, and you'll see this bat flying away from the Sun Pirate ship with this sort of mischievous smile, kind of similar to Moria. And I don't think this has anything to do with Moria, but I just think this is how Oda likes to draw bats. And its scream is also similar to how Moria laughs too. It's like kee kee kee, whereas Moria is kee shi shi shi. But that's not the part where I want to point out. It's more the fact that, like, for a message that's a bit more on the shady side, instead of sending this invitation to join the Shibukai with a seagull, who's, usually friendly looking, most communication is sent via a seagull in One Piece, like the news coup and stuff. But this time they opt to send this type of message with a much more sinister form of delivery as the bat. And so, and it has this like a sinister like smile too, like basically similar to Moria. So I just found that really funny and a very interesting like small world lore detail. And along with this, Jinbei is also allowed to free Arlong from Impel Down, which is interesting because the Marines saw fit to imprison Arlong there at this point in time, but for some reason, they didn't throw him in there after he was captured after his defeat to Luffy. And we didn't see him in Impel Down during the breakout. And I know in the grand scheme of things, Arlong isn't as dangerous as compared to most of the pirates, but he certainly feels dangerous enough to at least, be thrown into level 1 or 2 and not just some normal jail in like the East Blue. But I don't know. This has always been a mystery to me and many others. Like, where exactly are Arlong, Kurobi, and Chu being held? Like, we have yet to get any reference as to what happened to them, even as we're at chapter 1120 as of the time of this recording. Anyways, after this, Arlong decides to go his own way to reform the Arlong pirates. Jinbei and Arlong have a fight, but this fight is supposed to be a sort of a significant moment which leads to the events of Kokoyashi Village, but the fight is animated so poorly. It just doesn't quite have the impact I think that they wanted, and yeah, although to be fair, in the manga, this fight is only given 2 small panels, so in the grand scheme of things, I suppose it's not a big deal, but the animation is just so stiff, slow, and flat that it's really hard to watch and not kind of be taken out of the moment for me. Like, I really wish this scene was given a little bit more effort. Like when you watch this, it's so bad. And I can't help but, like, instead of like being in the moment, you're just like thinking, this is shit. Like, why does this look so bad? Which is really unfortunate because I feel like it is kind of a significant moment, because this is, like I said, the moment where Arlong and Jinbei really do split into 2 different paths. And this is right after this, Arlong goes to the East Blue and basically terrorizes Nami. And it's also at this point that the Macro trio splits off into their own pirate crew as well, and we know that they go on to become slave traders and human traffickers, as we saw in the Hachi cover story, and near the beginning of the Sabori arc as they sort of try and get Kami. But bringing an end to this chapter of the Sun Pirates, where Jinbei would now become a servant of the world government as a Shichibukai to protect his crew that were once slaves, as well as the people of Fishman Island. Arlong would then reform the Arlong Pirates to go on to do the events of Kokoyashi Village and the East Blue Saga, where he basically enslaves Nami. And then the Macro Pirates would go on to start their human trafficking business. And however, this flashback is not over yet. And oh no, we still have Otohime's part to resolve. And this is easily the more tragic part of this flashback and kind of bring everything together. So I am very looking forward to discussing this part with you, because I think while the first half of this flashback is very interesting, the second part is so much more heart-wrenching to watch, and it's easily one of the more tragic backstories that always gets me. So yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about it, even though it makes me cry every time. But yeah, that was a long episode, so we're going to bring it to their end there. And if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram and Twitter/X account at SunnyGo Podcast for updates of new episodes. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to listen to my podcast. I will have a spoiler section here because, again, because of how dense this is, there are definitely some things for spoiler stuff as well. But if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! Alrighty, so spoiler section. Again, this part's mostly non-scripted and more so just my ramblings, but a couple of things I wanted to talk about. The obvious symbolism and relation of the Sun Pirates' main mission and statement and goals are the fact that they want liberation and freedom, leading to Luffy becoming the eventual embodiment of that as the sun god Nika, whose greatest power and strength comes from being the most liberated and freest person in the world, cannot be lost on anyone. And it's interesting how they both tie together. And like I've talked about in past episodes, the whole sun and freedom is in a very common theme that keeps popping up. And I like the fact that eventually between Luffy and Jinbei, now being in the same crew, they will go on to fulfill both Fisher Tiger and Queen Otohime's goal of freeing the world, and particularly for Fishman as well. And so it'll be very interesting to see when Jinbei's dream is achieved and this whole Sun Pirate theme actually comes full circle. And yeah, it's a really cool revelation that the Sun Pirates, Jinbei, Luffy, the Nika and Joy Boy, and just the whole thing is really cool. How that all came together. The other thing I wanted to mention is just how we kind of get to know more about Arlong, and again, he has sort of the might is right philosophy, which is very similar to many sort of villains that we see, along with particularly Doflamingo, where he has sort of that mentality of the strongest get to be the right, the victor it gets to make history. And then of course we later go on to Wano with Kaido, whose entire philosophy is around the strongest get to survive, the strongest get to choose how they die. His entire sort of worldview is centered around this philosophy of might is right. And so it's interesting to see how Luffy and all of his most of his villains are kind of in that same sort of worldview, and just seeing all that come together, because we haven't yet seen Doflamingo, we haven't yet seen Kaido at this point in the story. So this theme kind of like starting to sort of crop up as we get to Dressrosa, we get to Whole Cake Island and Wano, and seeing all of that come together with Hody, Doflamingo, Big Mom, and then Kaido. Like they all kind of revolve around that same philosophy of might is right. Who kind of in stark contrast to Luffy doesn't really believe in that. Even weak people deserve to be free. And you really see that particularly once we see Shanks is his fleet, like all of his subordinate sort of pirate crews, when you see them introduced, which we just saw in the anime, as of the time of this recording in episode 11-12, is the fact that like all of the people in his sort of grand fleet are just pirate crews that are incredibly weak, who are no-name pirates, or just like really a ragtag group of just eclectic people. And you see that Shanks kind of subscribes to that, and he's the one outlier in terms of the sort of that dynamic, because you see Blackbeard also follow the might is right philosophy, but he is taking it to an even greater degree in just specifically taking the strongest devil fruits and giving it to his Titanic captains, and just amassing a fleet of people that are just strong. And then the last thing I kind of wanted to talk about in this spoiler section is Koala. Like, I honestly did not see Koala coming back into the story. I probably should have, but at the time I read the Fishman Island arc, I honestly did not expect to see Koala return. I just thought this was a sort of a one-off story of this little girl who was saved. Like, I guess I thought that maybe like she would have a small role to play later on. Like, we get to see what happened to her and she's living a happy life. But I did not expect her to play a major role in the story, as she returns in Dressrosa as part of the Revolutionary Army and a friend of Sabo. And it was really kind of shocking to see. I was like, oh, Koala's back. That's pretty cool. And not only is she back, she seems to be healthy and strong. Not only that, but like one of her partners and friends is a fishman in Hack. Like, I thought that was really cool, and I was kind of surprised and shocked. I mean, there was a lot of things that surprised and shocked me during all of that. I mean, Sabo's return was also quite shocking as well. And so all of that was really cool, and it fits so well that Koala would join the Revolutionary Army, because yeah, it turns out she did take Fisher Tiger's message to heart, and she's now trying to liberate everyone, and make sure that fishmen and humans all are able to live free. And so I really, really liked Koala's reappearance in the story as a member of the Revolutionary Army. So yeah, I'm like I said, I love Koala in this story, and so I can't wait to kind of talk about her once we get to Dressrosa. Anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about, and since this episode is nearing over 50 minutes, so yeah, I'm gonna cut it there. But thanks for listening, and hope to see you on the next episode. See ya!